Okay, so now we are going to start talking about how slavery was introduced to North America. We have to keep in mind here that we're talking about the British colonies in the 1600s, but the Spaniards had already started the slave trade. And so although the institution of slavery was not regularized and or legalized, by 1619, 1 million black slaves had already been brought from Africa to South America and the Caribbean to the Portuguese and Spanish colonies to work as slaves. So basically, the British just followed what they did. That's it. The Spaniards and the Portuguese, they were the ones that set the tone, that created this whole entire ecosystem of slavery, of profit, it's just, they really started some shit. They really were the ones that set the blueprint for a reality that led to so much fucking pain, destruction, chaos, trauma. This is what I'm saying. Christopher Columbus had his ass just stayed in Spain. None of this, the domino effect would not have happened. Because his expedition is what set the precedent for all of these European countries who wanted to colonize to just follow suit. About the British settlers and what they needed, the labor that they needed, and how desperate they were, we need to consider that the Indians were on their own land. The whites were in their own European culture. I'm reading directly from this book, okay? The blacks had been torn from their land and culture, forced into a situation where the heritage of language, dress, custom, family relations was bit by bit obliterated, except for the remnants that blacks could hold on to by sheer extraordinary persistence. I don't like saying blacks, like that sounds weird, but I'm reading it from here, okay? Was their culture inferior and so subject to easy destruction? Inferior in military capability, yes. Vulnerable to whites with guns and ships, but in no other way, except that cultures that are different are often taken as inferior, especially when such a judgment is practical and profitable. Even militarily, while the Westerners could secure forts on the African coast, they were unable to subdue the interior and had to come to terms with its chiefs. And so now we're going to start talking about what the dynamics were on the continent as these British people wanted slaves. European travelers in the 16th century were impressed with the African kingdoms of Timbuktu and Mali, already stable and organized at a time when European states were just beginning to develop into the modern nation. A Dutch report around 1602 on the West African kingdom of Benin said, "The town seemeth to be very great when you enter it. You go into a great broad street, not paved, which seemeth to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Wormhoes street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand." The inhabitants of the Guinea coast, I've heard people pronounce Guinea differently. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Of the Guinea coast were described by one traveler around 1680 as very civil and good-natured people, easy to be dealt with, condescending to what Europeans require of them in a civil way, and very ready to return double the presents we make them. So this is the interesting thing here that I want to point out. Africa had a kind of feudalism like Europe based on agriculture and hierarchies of lords and vassals. But African feudalism did not come, as did Europe's, out of the slave societies of Greece and Rome, which had destroyed ancient tribal life. In Africa, tribal life was still powerful, and some of its better features, a communal spirit, more kindness in law and punishment, still existed. And because the lords did not have the weapons that European lords had, they could not command obedience as easily. I have heard white supremacists especially be like, well, black people had slaves too. And shut the fuck up, that's first of all. And then slavery in Africa is not the same slavery as the slavery that was present in North America. As described here, there was a kind of feudalism, but these slaves had rights. They were able to own property. They were able to marry. They had laws. Here, it says slavery existed in the African states, and it was sometimes used by Europeans to justify their own slave trade. But as Davidson points out, Basil Davidson is the author of the book, The African Slave Trade. As Davidson points out, the slaves of Africa were more like serfs of Europe. In other words, like most of the population of Europe. It was a harsh servitude, but they had rights which slaves brought to America, which slaves brought to America did not have, and they were altogether different from the human cattle of the slave ships and the American plantations. In the Ashanti Kingdom of West Africa, one observer noted that a slave might marry, own property, himself own a slave, swear an oath, be a competent witness, and ultimately become heir to his master. An Ashanti slave, 9 cases out of 10, possibly became an adopted member of the family, and in time his descendants so merged and intermarried with the owner's kinsmen that only a few would know their origin. I am not going to sit here and say any kind of slavery is good, but to conflate American slavery to the slavery that was happening on the continent, it's not the same. It's not the same. And so for those people who try to draw parallels, it's impossible, because the slaves that were in these kingdoms still had some kind of dignity. They were treated with some level of respect, some modicum of respect, something. That the same could not be said for how the white people of North America were treating the slaves that came. Okay, so let's move on to the next video.